Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you with the most up-to-date political, economic, and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in. Okay, happy Saturday, everybody. We have a big episode today. We have two very important stories to cover. This may be one of the more important episodes that we've done on China Update for several weeks at least. There's so much from this week as well that there will probably be an extra episode tomorrow on Sunday to make sure that we're all caught up with the most salient developments from this week. But without any further ado, let's jump into today's episode. And the first big story we need to cover is on Friday afternoon, Beijing announced its most drastic move to shore up the crisis-hidden housing market, which has dragged on growth for several years now. More evidence that policymakers are deeply concerned by the crisis and that they have chosen bailouts and stimulus over deleveraging and shifting away from property-led growth. Policymakers announced a big package of measures to stabilize the real estate market, with the big three being 1, removing the mortgage rate floor for first and second home purchases, 2, reducing the minimum down payment ratios to the lowest ever from 20% to 15% for first home buyers and from 30% to 25% for second home buyers, and 3, a new re-lending facility of 300 billion RMB, $40 billion US dollars, with an interest rate of 1.75% for local state-owned enterprises to buy unsold properties in their regions and turn them into subsidized housing. US-based Bloomberg observed soon after the announcement, quote, "These moves are the strongest policies yet to lift up the country's plummeting real estate sector. Policymakers are bringing a sense of urgency to the matter, as official data Friday showed that home prices in April recorded the steepest month-on-month drops in a decade. That's even after a slew of incremental policies were issued to aid the sector." End quote. New home prices in 70 cities, excluding state-subsidized housing, slid 0.58% from March, according to National Bureau of Statistics figures released on Friday. Values of existing homes dropped 0.94%. From a year earlier, new home prices fell 3.51% in April, steeper than March's 2.7% drop. Existing home prices dropped 6.79%. Both were record declines since the Bureau began the current method of collecting data in 2011. There is no sugar-coating it. This is very poor data from Beijing's perspective. As the US-based Wall Street Journal explains, once valued at twice the size of the US residential market, quote, "Chinese property sector is in free fall. Sales have crumbled and construction has ground to a near halt." End quote. Since the start of the downturn, more than 50 developers, including once considered giants such as China Evergrande Group and Country Garden, have defaulted on their international debts. About 500,000 people have lost their jobs, according to Keyan, a private think tank based in Shanghai. Rosalia Yao, a real estate expert at Gavical, a China-focused research firm, expressed yesterday, quote, "Policymakers are desperate to boost sales." End quote. Yan Yuejin, research director at eHouse China Research and Development Institute, expressed on Friday's announcement, quote, "This is the most relaxed down payment policy ever in China. It signals the central government is really prioritizing home buying demand." End quote. Veteran China analyst Bill Bishop observed yesterday, quote, "These are big moves and a signal policymakers are very worried and want things to stabilize." End quote. Lu Ting, chief China economist at investment bank Nomura, said these measures signal, quote, "the beginning of the end of China's housing crisis." End quote. The markets were very happy, initially at least, as well. Chinese property stocks surged on Friday. The Shanghai Stock Exchange Property Index climbed as much as 3.2% before pairing some gains. Shares of Chinese developers jumped 3.68% on Friday after the announcement. The benchmark has rallied 31% in March. Shares of real estate giant Sunac China jumped 26%, while Hong Kong-listed shares of China Vanke rose 19%. But there is a very obvious question that comes to mind as we discuss this policy rollout. Will the government program to buy unsold properties be enough? Regular viewers will immediately notice that the 300 billion RMB, $41 billion US dollars, is much less than the tens of trillions of yuan estimated by Guotai Junan Securities necessary to buy up the massive inventory of unsold homes. According to China's National Bureau of Statistics, as of March, the inventory of unsold homes was equivalent to 748 million square meters, or more than 8 billion square feet. Nomura estimates that there are as many as 20 to 30 million unfinished homes, and that it would cost the government at least $440 billion to complete them and clear the logjam. In a note on Monday, Goldman Sachs estimates that there was around $4 trillion of residential inventory on a cost basis at the end of last year, including land and projects under construction. Around 45% of that are homes that are either completed or ready for pre-sales. The bank said the property developers need approximately $400 to $600 billion of funding to go back to normal operations. Quote, "The funding discussed is not enough given the scale of the problem, so it looks like they hope the mortgage rate floor removal and down payment percentage cuts, along with the effective message that they have made complete a reversal on restrictions in property speculation, will be enough to convince enough people to start buying again to break the downward cycle and create a better feedback loop where people start worrying they will miss the bargains if they don't jump back into the market. That seems smart if it works to leverage people's savings to help with the bailout rather than having the government fund it all. A few years ago, any of these measures would have worked to spark lots of buying, but that was when everyone thought real estate would always go up. Will these measures shift sentiment materially and flip the down loop into a positive feedback loop that gets animal spirits excited again?" End quote. It is difficult to know. And of course, if the government provides heavy subsidies to home buyers again, as they are here, there is the risk that it would create a moral hazard and risk fueling another, more dangerous bubble. The next few months will be critical to follow to see whether this housing crisis, as Lu Ting put it, has reached the beginning of the end. Next up, Putin's trip to China and the further emergence of the anti-Western axis. If you're getting some value from today's episode, I have a big favor to ask. That is to hit the like button, and if you haven't already, subscribe. It's just 2 clicks of the mouse, but it is the only way in which this channel can grow and is a huge help. Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links are also in the description below for those who want to go the extra mile and help keep China Update sustainable. Thank you so much, everybody, for the ongoing support. Next up, Russian leader Vladimir Putin has completed his 2-day visit to Beijing, flying back to Moscow Friday evening. She welcomed Putin at the Great Hall of the People with a tightly choreographed ceremony featuring a 21-gun salute, a marching band, an honor guard, and children jumping and waving in sync. From the readouts, it looks like Putin has had a good visit with Xi, formally having a 2-hour meeting of talks in Beijing on Thursday. The two sides issued a very long joint statement with very sharp and frankly in places concerning comments on the US, including, quote, "strengthening coordination and cooperation to address the so-called dual containment policy of the United States, which is unconstructive and hostile towards China and Russia," end quote. Putin and Xi accused the US of planning to station missile systems around the world that, quote, "pose a direct threat to the security of Russia and China," end quote. Xi stressed the friendship between Moscow and Beijing, saying he and Putin provided each other with, quote, "strategic guidance," end quote, before the pair signed the statement on deepening their strategic partnership. The statement condemned attempts to seize sovereign assets, a clear reference to Western discussions over giving some of Russia's frozen sovereign funds to Ukraine, and said the countries reserve the right to respond against them. Russia reiterated its support for Beijing's Taiwan policy. Taiwan's foreign minister, Joseph Wu, addressed Putin's visit in an interview with the Associated Press, saying Western powers should continue to support Ukraine as part of sending a message that democracies will defend one another. Quote, "If Ukraine is defeated at the end, I think China is going to get inspired, and they might take even more ambitious steps in expanding their power in the Indo-Pacific, and it would be disastrous for the international community," end quote. Interestingly, North Korea featured heavily in the joint statement too. Quote, "The two sides oppose the deterrence actions of the United States and its allies in the military field, and instigation of confrontation with the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, and the possible escalation of tensions on the Korean Peninsula that may lead to armed conflicts. The two sides urge the United States to take effective measures to ease military tensions and create favorable conditions, abandon intimidation and suppression means. The two sides reiterate that political and diplomatic means are the only way out to resolve all issues on the peninsula, and call on the international community to support the constructive joint initiatives of China and Russia," end quote. The two celebrated greater trade ties as well, with Putin noting that 90% of trade between Russia and China was settled in yuan and rubles, as they signed agreements on deepening cooperation in areas ranging from energy and military exercises to AI and space exploration. Putin added that Moscow and Beijing had agreed to step up banking ties and increase the use of national payment systems. Xin Hong, an international relations professor at Xiamen University in Beijing, said finding a way to restore bank transactions and trade volume may be the summit's, quote, number one topic of discussion, end quote. Interestingly, though, likely in a disappointment for Putin, there was no new deal announcements for the massive Power of Siberia 2 program. Indeed, Alexei Miller, a close Putin confidant who heads state gas export monopoly Gazprom, was conspicuously absent from Russia's delegation, indicating little progress on the long-awaited pipeline. On Friday, in a symbolic move, Putin visited the Harbin Institute of Technology in the northeast of the country, which boasts more than a century of scientific exchange between Russians and Chinese. As the US-based New York Times explains, quote, the institute has become one of the most important military research universities in China, developing some of the technologies that the Kremlin may want, as Moscow and Beijing deepen their military cooperation, end quote. Yet all of this paints a bizarre picture of Beijing's strategic tightrope, as China continues to tell Europeans that its companies are not helping Putin wage his war against Ukraine, and that Beijing is a neutral party supportive of European security interests. On Thursday, state-run Global Times writes, quote, China has rebuffed US claims accusing the Chinese side of supplying Russia with materials for weapons manufacturing. China has always taken a prudent and responsible attitude in the export of military products, strict control of dual-use items, including commercial drones exports. These remarks were made after media reports cited US officials claiming that Chinese materials are filling critical gaps in Russia's defense production cycle and helping Moscow undertake its most ambitious defense expansion since the Soviet era, end quote. Some academics have pointed out that Beijing at this point doesn't really have an incentive to shift its Russia or Ukraine policy either. Quote, even if China compromises on a range of issues, including cutting back support on Russia, it's unlikely that the US or the West will drastically change their attitude to China as a competitor. They see very little incentive for compromise, end quote. One pushback to this argument, however, may be that decisions like the initial support for Russia's war are some of the very drivers of Western attitudes towards China as a competitor. While touring a China-Russia expo, Putin concluded the two-day visit in a speech emphasizing the country's burgeoning strategic ties, as well as his own personal relationship with Xi Jinping. The partnership between China and Russia, he said, is not directed against anyone. Quote, it is aimed at one thing, creating better conditions for the development of our countries and improving the well-being of the people of China and the Russian Federation, end quote. But in a backhanded shot at the United States and its allies, he added, quote, an emerging multipolar world is now taking shape before our eyes, and it is important that those who are trying to maintain their monopoly on decision-making in the world on all issues do everything in their power to ensure that this process goes naturally, end quote. So, what are the implications of this strengthening China-Russian axis for the world generally and the US-led Western alliance specifically? Charles Mitcher, a non-resident fellow with the Democratic Resilience Program at the Center for European Policy Analysis, published a good commentary this week discussing this very question. Let's end by examining some of the points made in this piece, titled China-Russia Axis Heralds an Ominous Future, which we're now quoting selected excerpts from directly. Since the end of World War II, the United States has excelled at building and maintaining stable security relationships, with NATO being the prime example. In contrast, America's adversaries have been largely unable to forge enduring and effective great power partnerships. The turbulent relationship between the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China during the Cold War, which sometimes descended into armed conflict, serves as a powerful reminder that a shared ideology can often divide more than unite. Currently, a unity of purpose between the autocratic powers has created the closest relationship in decades. China and Russia are forging a partnership increasingly reminiscent of a great power alliance. The war in Ukraine has brought out a core strategic realignment in the global power distribution that is fast redefining the world order. The Sino-Russian partnership that many thought only a few years back would not be possible is now a new geopolitical reality.
In short, we may be entering a period in which the US will be confronted by two adversaries determined to upend the global order built by Washington and its democratic allies in Europe and Asia. The key variable is just how strong and enduring this Sino-Soviet partnership will be in the great power competition, and how it shapes the power distribution in the Atlantic and the Pacific, as well as alignments across an increasingly developing world. The two states are allies not because they share any particular cultural or ideological affinity. Rather, they have come together on account of an old adage that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Their partnership is largely practical. This is realpolitik alignment. Both parties believe they have more to gain from continuing to work together than they risk losing. Their economic relationship deepened after the West imposed sanctions on Russia in the wake of its 2022 all-out invasion of Ukraine. The boom has largely served Chinese interests, with Russia increasingly in a subordinate position. Russia's growing dependence on China has serious implications for Moscow's economic future, but more importantly, it poses a security threat to the US and its allies in Asia. As Moscow becomes increasingly dependent on Beijing, the latter will be able to demand access to key areas of military technology that the Russians have developed since the end of the Cold War. This is particularly true of Russian development in hypersonics and nuclear propulsion technology. Should China, the world factory, find a way to access and absorb the latest military technology from Russia, the global military balance could tilt decisively. For the US, this is the greatest dilemma facing its military planners and political decision-makers alike. Are we about to witness, in the military domain, China's ability to leapfrog technological and manufacturing development, much as it did in the civilian sector? If so, the threat posed by the People's Liberation Army Navy to the United States Navy in the future confrontation over Taiwan would grow exponentially, requiring both new planning on the Pentagon's part and a significantly expanded investment in the size of the US military. The two great powers, should they continue to work in tandem, will be well positioned to dominate Eurasia, forcing the United States to revisit its historic strategic dilemma, i.e., whether America can remain secure in its hemispheric homeland and free to pursue its economic and security interests worldwide, if Russia and China control the Eurasian landmass and strike out beyond regional hegemony to control the world's oceans. Here ends the direct quote and today's episode of China Update. I would very much be interested to know what you all think of both of these stories. Both, I think, are very important developments to cover in the comments below. Thank you so much, everybody, for watching. Have a great Saturday. Have a restful weekend. And I will see you all tomorrow.